Politics is how we as a society come together to deliver services, establish policies, regulate our collective behavior. And so politics is intimately intertwined with society. If you want to understand how society works, you have to understand how politics and government work. And then the second part of that is a deep belief that I have that we can make sense of that process, that things happen for reasons in the political process. And trying to figure that out is, to me, endlessly fascinating.
One of the things that I found missing in the books that I had used is the excitement of politics and getting students really interested in politics. And that's certainly something I always have tried to do in teaching the class, is to show students why it's relevant for their lives, to make them care about American politics in a way that will carry through to after they graduate. And so I've always had it a goal to make the Intro to American Politics class really engage the students, make them interested in American politics. So one thing that at Wisconsin, where I teach, when I first started teaching the class, about half of my students were required to be there as education majors. That they often would come into the class, they didn't really want to take this as one of their requirements, and you could kind of just see it in their faces that, oh man, here's this requirement I have to take. But I can't tell you the number of students that then at the end of the semester say, hey, I thought American politics was boring, but I really see now that it is exciting and interesting and relevant for my life. And then later I would often see some of these students at the voting booth when I'd be voting on election day, and they'd come up and tell me, hey, I'm here today because of your class. It really got me interested, and I'm voting now. I'd never voted before. And so that's the kind of engagement and excitement that we try to put forward in the textbook, and to make it an accessible book that students really will want to read and are interested in reading. And that's something I think was missing from other textbooks that we have tried to do in this book.
David and I began our career together at Duke University as assistant professors teaching the intro class. And we soon discovered that we had a very common sense of how we would like to teach the class and what kind of book we would like to go along with it. And one of the problems we saw with existing texts was that the color of politics, the excitement of politics, the why it was interesting to look at, to study, and why it was necessary to understand what was going on was really absent from the texts. All the color was drained out. They seemed almost solemn, ponderous in their discussion of everyday politics. And we wanted a book that we could refer to and that would bring that into the class, so that the excitement we felt in describing politics, and the excitement a lot of students had, would be reflected in the book. We also wanted a book that took political science research seriously, that the political science community had something to say about the big questions about how government works, and also could address the questions that students had about the political process, why things happen, who wins and loses in elections, why Congress does one thing and not another.
The thing that sets the book apart from other textbooks is this focus on conflict and compromise. That we have in each of the chapters, we set up with an introductory segment on here's something that's really conflictual in American politics, and we argue that conflict that is essential, is an inherent part of American politics, and it's not something that is to be feared, not something that is to see as a problem in American politics, but rather as a central part of American politics. You can't have politics without conflict. And so we take that on centrally, and instead of seeing it as something that is a problem with the system, you need to understand conflict in order to understand politics. And then also to look at how the political system deals with that conflict through compromise. And that yes, there are some conflicts that can't be bridged. There are some conflicts that will be there for quite some time. But yet there are many other conflicts that can be solved through the political process and through compromise. And that, I think, is one of the main things that we want students to get from this book, is that the system does work to solve conflict through the political system and through the process and through compromise.
The thing that makes our book distinctive is that we didn't start with the idea of presenting a lot of facts or data, that sort of thing. What we wanted was a perspective to offer students how to think about politics or how to study politics. And what we arrived at was first the notion that politics made sense, that you could explain politics, and that moreover, you could come up with a good explanation of what we see in American politics by focusing on a fairly small set of concepts. One, the idea that politics is conflictual and that compromise is fundamental to American politics. The second being that process matters, that the rules and procedures that govern the political process influence outcomes, and moreover, are chosen with that influence in mind. And third, the notion that politics is everywhere, that you may not like what government does, but its impact on your life is inescapable for all of us.
While conflict and compromise is the key idea of the textbook, there are the three themes of the book are political conflict, process matters, and that politics is everywhere. And the three are definitely related to each other. So starting with conflict being central, as I talked about already, the way where process comes in is it's the political process that is the mechanism through which conflict is solved. And so students need to gain an understanding of how, say, policy gets made in Congress, and the role of the rules of the legislative procedure, the role of committees, the role of party leadership. And once you have an understanding that those different institutions play in the policymaking process, that then gives you the leverage to understand how conflict is solved. And so political process matters means that this is the mechanism we use to make everyday policy and to solve the conflict in the political system. And so that's the second idea that really is clearly linked to resolving conflict. And the notion that politics is everywhere is related to the first point I made about showing students how politics is really accessible, that it's not that different than what's going on in their regular everyday lives. And so students, I'm sure, have conflict. If they live in a group house with roommates, there's going to be conflict about how the dishes get washed or how different chores get done. And as we talk about in the textbook, a collective action problem that can, the same kind of collective action problem that members of Congress face. And so there are those ideas that are central to understanding politics. They're also central to understanding how your own everyday life works. And so the three themes then of conflict, process, and politics is everywhere really do work together as a whole for getting a better understanding of how the political process really works. For example, the healthcare reform process that went through much of 2009, 2010, was often portrayed as just this vicious partisan battle. And if you looked at the way the media talked about this, it was often, the obstructionist Republicans are stopping the Democrats from getting what they want, and Scott Brown's elected, and the whole thing, blows up. And there was always, in much of the discussion, there was this focus on just the conflict and the partisan squabbling and so on. But if you look at the process of healthcare reform from our perspective of conflict, compromise, and process, I think you can gain an understanding of actually how the events evolved as they did. So, for example, when the Democrats dropped the public option as part of their package of things that they would want in the healthcare bill that would emerge, people on the left were screaming, "Oh, you're selling out to the Republicans. This is something that is undermining healthcare reform." But when you look at it from the perspective of conflict and compromise, it's something the Democrats had to do to be able to bring the Blue Dog Democrats on board. They knew, they just did the head count. They knew they didn't have the votes to pass this within their party unless they gave up the public option and compromised with the Blue Dogs in the party. So from the lens of conflict and compromise, that decision to give up the public option makes sense.
Well, we've made 3 changes for the second edition. The first is to keep the text as up to date as possible. One of the things that always bothered David and I about the text that we were using was that many of the examples, while they were not old in our terms, they were certainly set before the time that many of our students started to pay attention to politics. So our goal was to keep the text ruthlessly contemporary. And we define that as at least half the examples have to be less than 4 years old, so that students really get a sense that we're talking about the politics they know. And we can also leverage what they know about politics to dig a little bit deeper into these issues. The second thing we've done is we've emphasized the idea of politics being conflictual and the need for compromise in the political process. We do that largely with the intro stories, where each chapter sets up what is the conflict in this particular area, why has compromise come up as something that needed to be considered. And we really draw that thread through the text while continuing to really emphasize the importance of process and the idea that politics is everywhere. And the third thing we've done is to deepen the attention to research in the book by adding boxes. We call them "What do political scientists do?", where we're talking about a particular piece of research done by a political scientist. And the idea is really twofold. First, to give students an idea of how research works, that when political scientists work on a problem, they don't pull the answers out of the air. They formulate hypotheses, they collect data, they see what the data tells them. And also to show them that this is not something that is beyond their understanding, that in the end the research process, just like everything else, is a matter of training and practice, along with the boxes about political science research. The other thing we've added are videos where we bring the authors of this research, we sat them down and asked them about how they came to study these questions, how they studied them, what they found out. And we're really aiming at doing two things with these videos. One is to give students an idea of what the research process is about, how we arrive at our conclusions, and to have people express that in their own words, to talk about how they struggled, the false starts they might have made, and how they came to their conclusions. And the second thing we're trying to do is to try and bring the citations in the text alive. I think one of the problems in writing a textbook is we want to cite the academic research, but citations don't have much life to them. So here we're going to bring Jim Stimson or Dave Rohde or Dave Lewis or John Sides into your classroom for a little while, and they can explain why they did what they did. And in doing so, I think we're trying to show students that we are both teachers and scholars of political science. Dave Canon was a natural to co-author a textbook with. He's one of my oldest friends in the discipline. We were assistant professors together. We learned how to teach intro American politics together. More than that, David and I complement each other really well. We're trained in somewhat different intellectual traditions, but we see politics the same way. We see the teaching enterprise and the research enterprise in the same way. And the good thing is, because our training and our research is somewhat different, we can integrate that difference of perspective into a unified approach in the textbook.
One of the real virtues, I think, of our textbook are the policy chapters and the way we integrate the institution side of American political science. That in the policy chapters, we make a real effort to show how theoretical work and empirical work on American institutions shapes the outcome of public policy. So just to give one example, in the bureaucracy chapter, we have a good discussion, I think, of the theoretical work and empirical work on the nature of agency design and bureaucratic structure, bureaucratic control, many of the issues that political science have talked about in the bureaucracy for the last couple of decades. That literature on the bureaucracy that Bill wrote that chapter really informs and helps shape my chapter on economic policy, where I talk about things like the importance of the control of the Fed, one of the important institutions of economic policy making and monetary policy. And that same literature that Bill talks about in the bureaucracy chapter also shapes and informs that chapter on economic policy making, with that central problem of how do politicians controlled economic policy making process, in this specific instance, the Federal Reserve Board. And so that's just one example of how our different backgrounds but our overlapping interests really help make it a stronger textbook.
I think the thing that students are most surprised by is the idea that we really can't explain what happens. I think that they come into the class, generally speaking, thinking that politics is just too chaotic, that it's a buzzing complexity that no one can make sense of. And I don't think, I wouldn't want to say that political scientists have it all down, but on some of the big questions, we have some insights about why things happen as they do. And my goal in the class, and from the feedback, I think students get this loud and clear, is that we can make sense of politics, that politics is explainable.
One thing I think that students, after they're done with my class and done with reading the textbook, that it happens consistently at the end of every semester, or students come up to me at the end of the class and they say, I thought politics was boring before I took this class, and now I'm really engaged in politics. And they tell me that they have started to read political blogs, and they start reading the newspapers on a regular basis, and they're just much more involved in paying attention to American politics now. That they see that the politics is relevant for their lives, and they are more interested and engaged in specific questions than they had been before. So just to give one example from class this last week, I was lecturing on economic policymaking. Some really difficult questions about reforming the financial system, and we talked about derivatives and credit default swaps and all these complicated things that the reformers are talking about right now. And after class, I had a line of like 8 students who came up to me to ask questions about this, and we stood there and talked for 20 minutes after the class was over, because they were so interested in this and so wanting to better understand what was going on with the economic crisis and the reforming the financial system. And so to me, being able to have that kind of engaging of the students through the textbook and through the class itself is maybe the most surprising thing and the most gratifying thing for me as a teacher. When I was an undergraduate, I thought I was going to go to law school, as many of my friends were doing. My sister was in law school. The family thought I'd be a good lawyer. So that was kind of just where I was drifting towards. And then I started talking to people who I knew who were lawyers, and found out that most of them weren't real happy in their careers. That they were pretty unhappy, in fact, with being a lawyer. So I thought, maybe I don't want to do this. So I started talking to other people in the political science department, and always have been interested in politics, and realized that this actually can be a career. You can study what you're interested in rather than doing something just because you think it's going to be the right thing to do for your career. So following my passion, my interest in politics, which I'd had from a very young age, it seemed like a natural thing to do once I gave up the idea of going to law school. And so I went to graduate school at the University of Minnesota, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Well, like most political science students, I had expected that I would go to law school, would possibly go into government work as a policy analyst of some kind. What happened was really quite fortuitous. A professor who I had in one of my classes, at the end of the class, asked me that, she said I did reasonably well in the class. I seemed to be very interested, and maybe I should consider doing a PhD. And that idea came out of nowhere. It was one that I warmed up to very quickly. And once I realized that I could make a career out of studying, trying to understand politics, that was what I wanted to do without any reservations at all.
I guess one response is that political science is a big tent. We certainly have some people who do very theoretical work that is aimed at developing theory, hypotheses, can be quite abstract and not as directly connected to the real world as some other things. But then the continuum down to those that do very applied policy work. And I think the way that I do political science is somewhere between those two extremes, where my work is theoretically motivated, but very much grounded in the real world of politics. That everything that I work on is engaging something that's actually going on in politics today. And that certainly is one thing that we've tried to do in the textbook, that we want to infuse the textbook with this sense that politics is everywhere, that political science is relevant for the everyday practice of politics and how people experience the political world. And so the things that happen in people's everyday life actually is very much connected to political science. That's something that we try to develop in the textbook.
What I tell people is that the details of politics matter, and that by understanding the details, we can begin to explain what we see. If we look at, say, the enactment of healthcare legislation, one of the primary explanations for how the legislation was enacted as it did, and for what the legislation looked like, what it does, is a consequence of the processes by which those decisions are made, beginning with the Constitution and a bicameral legislature, but also the rules of procedure in the House and the Senate. And political science can give us insights into how process matters. And I think that's an insight that you wouldn't find anywhere else. It's certainly not something you see in public discussion of the issues. It's not something you see often in even journalistic discussions of the issues.
In talking about partisanship in Congress, the way that I present this is to link it to our broader idea of politics as conflictual, and there's always going to be conflict in politics. Indeed, this is probably Exhibit A in showing that very point, that there is going to be conflict in politics. And so the way that I look at this is not that partisanship is something that's wrong with the system, or something that's evil with the system, or that partisan bickering is bad, the way that the general public tends to think about this, but instead that this is a natural part of the political system, and that we need to have competing parties who have different ideas about how the government should be structured. And indeed, you can make an argument that in order to have an accountable democracy, it's good to have strong parties with different perspectives of where they stand. And if the citizens don't like what policies are being produced, they have the ability of the voting booth to kick out the majority party and put in a different party. So having strong political parties with differing views is part of this inherently conflictual nature of our process, and it's something that once it's understood from that perspective, I think not only gives a better understanding of how the process works, but also then addresses some of these normative concerns that people have, that somehow this is something that's bad or flawed in the system.
I see conflict in Washington as inevitable. James Madison, 200 years ago, wrote that the urge to differ is universal, that in a country as large as ours, as diverse as ours, people are going to have different ideas about what they want government to do. And politics is where those ideas are set against each other and choices are made about whose views prevail. So in that sense, the debate over health care or financial reform or bailouts or climate change doesn't surprise me at all. That's what I expect to happen in a country like the United States. The way I think about the 2010 elections, the way I teach them in my class, I like to go back to the research. And the first piece of research that I talk about is the idea that congressional elections are connected. The Democrats have picked up seats in the last two elections, in the 2006 midterms and in the 2008 presidential election. And in that sense, they have a lot of members who are vulnerable. So it would be no surprise if the Republicans take back seats in 2010. The big question is how many. And there I go to some of the work we talk about in the textbook, Jim Stimson's work on public opinion and elections. And the big takeaway from that research is that it's the state of the economy that matters. If the economy recovers by the midterm elections, Democratic losses will be limited. If the economy is still mushing along or worse by 2010, it is going to be a very bad night for Barack Obama and the Democratic Party. As to what's going to happen after that, I think regardless of how the elections play out, the administration's achievements in the first 2 years are unlikely to be continued simply because they have done so much in the first 2 years. So I wouldn't necessarily connect that to the election, but rather to a much larger cycle in politics.
Forecasting is always a hazardous business, and so anytime that political scientists try to pin down exactly what's going to happen, often like predicting the weather, you're going to be wrong more often than you're right. Now, having said that, obviously we all love to forecast. We all love to try to predict what's going to happen. And one thing we can say with certainty about the elections this fall, the Democrats are obviously going to lose seats in the House and the Senate. The question is, what's the magnitude of those losses? How big are the losses going to be? And it's going to range from, on the low end, from an average midterm loss to the high end, potentially still losing control of the House and or Senate. And so it's more likely than not going to be somewhere between those two extremes, but in any event, it will have an impact on Obama's domestic agenda, because I think the Republicans, in picking up seats, will even be more likely to want to push their agenda, and this can take two different possible tracks. On the one hand, they may even become more obstructionist. Having been strengthened in the number of seats that they have, will say, okay, we can just basically stop anything we want. We now obviously can filibuster pretty much anything we want to in the Senate, and so they'll be able to stop the Obama agenda cold. On the other hand, they may say, okay, we're strengthened now, so we're in a better bargaining position. We might be able to get more compromises from the Democrats on policies, and certainly from the perspective of our textbook, that would be, I think, the more likely outcome, is that when they pick up seats, they gain in bargaining position, they'll be able to extract more compromises, so it's possible that even counterintuitively, more could get done than had been true before the midterms.